Hello and welcome to the first video of this year's World History Study, High School World History. Again, my name is Chuck Vipperman. You can call me Mr. Chuck if you like. Mr. Vipperman is quite a mouthful. The idea is that I'm going to record these videos on Friday, usually before we meet on Monday, and we will discuss what the video is all about on Monday. And again, I'll tell you again, I know some of you don't like talking in class back and forth, but I really do encourage that. If you got a question or an observation, bring it up. We'll talk about it and hopefully get a good bunch of back and forth. Again, I'll reiterate, I am less interested in you being able to retain names, dates, and numbers, although there will be some that you really should remember to have a full grasp of history. But I want you to remember the causes and effects, the motivations of the people and peoples that make history. And again, like I've told many of you in orientation, history is not was, history is. And we're always discovering more about our history, and it has an uncanny habit of influencing our daily lives, whether or not we realize it. That's one thing I've always been keenly interested in, is taking historic events and trying to figure out, all right, what the heck does this have to do with the year 2022? We'll be discussing that throughout. We will be starting in the Renaissance era, and going really up until just before the official founding of our country, the United States of America. Remember, before the Renaissance, and for those of you who had me last year, this will be a bit of a recap. About 1,000 years between Rome and the Renaissance, the fall of the Roman Empire. You had the so-called Dark Ages in Europe, where there was not a lot of information being shared. For a few centuries, you had that unifying presence of the Roman government that ruled most of Europe. You had common currency, common language. Again, the Roman Empire was far from perfect. We've chronicled there are many shortcomings. But one of the pluses is it did provide an exchange of goods and ideas. What we saw happen during the Dark Ages, without this unifying influence, basically Europe fractured into a whole bunch of different pieces, much smaller pieces than the countries that we know today. You had little fiefdoms, duchies, vassals, whatever you want to call them, but just very small areas where usually there was one ruling body, usually the wealthiest family. And of course, we talked about the feudal system, where it was possible to live your life if you were a peasant and not meet anybody that lived more than 10 miles away from you. So what happens there is ideas are not exchanged, concepts are not exchanged. You might have a great idea for a way that public resources could be best allocated, but you're only able to tell your friends. The idea doesn't go beyond you and your little village or fief, and it dies with you and dies with them. What happens or begins to happen during the Renaissance is these ideas start to be exchanged among a lot of different people. And that exchange of information, again, we talked about it at the end of last year's class, the invention of the printing press led to the Renaissance. Renaissance is the enhanced sharing of ideas. It technically means rebirth of ancient Greek and Roman thought, and that'll be something we'll talk a little bit about this week. Throughout the year, we're also going to talk about, in addition to the Renaissance expanding the mind, the explorers began expanding the seas, or exploring the seas, we should say. The technology made it to where ships could have a reasonable chance of navigating long distances. And so these great oceans that people in Europe and in other countries had been seeing for years, they now began to travel on them. And continents that had had no interchange of ideas for centuries, millennia, began to share ideas. There was conquering, of course. That is human history, unfortunately. Uh, Quite frankly, most of human history has been the idea that might makes right. We're also this year going to take a look, and again, we're teaching from a Christian standpoint here, the fundamental changes to the church, the Catholic Church in particular, which dominated this era of history, and they are still struggles that we are dealing with today. We're going to start in jolly old England. That little island has led to a lot of history, and again, we have a focus on Europe and on our United States 2022, our direct political and social ancestors. And a whole lot of history occurred on this little island of Great Britain. We're going to pick it up in the year 1455. And again, very, very brief history lesson on England. You'll recall that years and thousands of years ago, the Druids built Stonehenge, and later about the Celts lived in most of the Great Britain. The Romans came and actually lived alongside the Celts. When the Roman Empire collapsed, the Romans basically left the Celts on their own, and they had to fight invading Saxons and Angles and Jutes. This was the era of King Arthur. And of course later the Danish Vikings came along and began settling large parts of England, settling in quotation marks. But they were eventually incorporated into the larger Great Britain kingdom by Alfred the Great. And of course the pivotal event came in the year 1066, the Battle of Hastings. William the Conqueror crosses the English Channel from Normandy and established Norman rule over England, pretty much instituted the feudal system. And of course we learned in our last year about sort of a pre-Renaissance spark. King John was a horrible king, but of course he was king. And kings, according to most of history and most of the attitudes of the people, they were kings not by accident. It was divine right. Well, some nobles, well-to-do people, families in England, started asking the question, why in the world should I be forced to follow what this person is when this person is so clearly flawed? What can I do to stop this bad person from having power over me? The Magna Carta, 1215. The nobles gained enough military might to force King John to sign the Magna Carta, which for the first time really in recorded history placed explicit limits on the power of a king. Now, British Parliament was formed at this time, again, a ruling body, not royalty. So kind of a new idea for them. Of course, years ago, centuries ago, Athens was a democracy. There were democratic elements to Rome. They had a senate. So you start to see the ball rolling. People are starting to wonder, okay, why do we owe our lives to this king? Why do we owe our lives to this person based on who their parents were? And that way of thinking really started picking up steam in the Renaissance. But anyway, we go back to England, 1455. The ruling house at the time, and a house is basically a center of power, usually based on family, but doesn't have to be. I mean, non-family members can become prominent members of the house. If you are familiar with Game of Thrones, all the political intrigue is around houses, political seats of power. House of Lancaster was ruling the nation in the year 1455. This included a line of three kings, including Henry's the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth. Henry the Sixth was very feeble physically, and he had basically probably was a full-blown schizophrenic. He was functionally insane. So what do you do when you have a king that is absolutely insane? Well, the House of York in the northern part of England decided to take action. They had hoped for years to gain control of the nation, and in the year 1455, they raised an army and attacked the House of Lancaster in the Battle of St. Albans. The Yorkists won. It's called the War of the Roses because each house, as their coat of arms, had a rose, a white rose for the House of York and a red rose for the House of Lancaster. Now, oddly enough, even though the House of York won this battle, Parliament still kept Henry VI as king. What they did was they took the Duke of York, the head of the House of York, and named him Lord Protector of England. Well, the Duke of York began using that authority to sort of ease this crazy king out of the picture. And he more or less ran the country during Henry's episodes of mental illness. Well, Henry was married to Queen Margaret, and she was very worried that her son would never inherit the throne because the Duke of York was exerting so much control over things. So, 1460, we have another battle, the Battle of Wakefield. The Duke of York was taken care of. He was slain in combat. Now, the message of the Queen saying, okay, now my son can be king. Parliament threw him another curveball. Parliament declared that the son of the Duke of York was going to be the next king of England. His name was Edward. He became Edward IV at the tender young age of 19. Now, again, this is one of those series of history. I'm not going to bog you down with all the details, but there were lots of political intrigue working behind the scenes that eventually got Edward eased out of the throne, and the crazy guy, Henry VI, put back on the throne of England. And by that point, he was full-blown schizophrenic. He didn't even know where it was. I mean, he was being abused. What happened was the Edward, having been ousted from the throne, declared war against Henry, and Edward won. This time he took care of the Henry VI problem by having him executed. So Edward IV of the House of York is now King of England in the year 1471. Well, within the House of York, there was a battle going on too. You see, Edward IV had two young sons. He also had a brother named Richard, who wanted to be the next king. You can see the problem starting to develop here. In 1483, Edward IV died unexpectedly. Richard, his brother, and the two boys' uncle, allegedly, this has never been proven, but most likely what happened, they locked up the boy king and his younger brother. The boy king was 12 and his younger brother was 9. They disappeared. You can draw your own conclusions. And Richard, by default, became King Richard III of England. Again, the true fate of the two boys is one of the great mysteries of the era. People still have theories about it today, but anyway, House of York is still in control here, and Richard III is the king. The House of Lancaster, of course, was still around. They didn't think too much of Richard III. They were terrified of him. They couldn't... They decided to act. They didn't want to wait to find out what he had in store for them, so they hatched a plan. It involved yet another guy named Henry. This guy's name was Henry Tudor. He was a very wealthy lord from another house. He raised an army against Richard III and defeated him. Richard III was killed in this battle. Then a very conspicuous thing happened. Henry Tudor wanted peace between the Lancasters and the Yorks. And so he, going against all Lancaster tradition, took his wife as a lady from the House of York. He wanted to unite the feuding families once and for all. The woman he chose to marry was, believe it or not, the daughter of Edward IV, who had died unexpectedly earlier. She was also the younger sister of the two princes that Richard III disappeared. This sounds like a soap opera, doesn't it? Because it is. This is a lot of British history around the crown. The king has made for some great movies and art over the years. Henry decided to end the Lancaster versus York battle for all by basically dissolving the names. He dropped the names Lancaster and York and renamed his family the House of Tudor. And he became Henry VII, King of England, House of Tudor. As a full or a very visual graphic sign of the reconciliation, the House of Tudor's coat of arms included a rose that was white and red, the colors of the houses of Lancaster and York. Another cool tradition he started, again, he was a little bit paranoid, which the way kings dropped in England, you can understand why. He established England's first royal guard called the Beefeaters. They were sworn to protect the Tower of London and to protect the king at all times. Beefeaters has become quite a tradition in England. If you go to the Tower of London today, it's guarded by Beefeaters. It's a proud tradition. Beefeaters are supposed to be not only great warriors, but also historians of England. It's a very neat tradition that they started. All right, we're going to move forward a couple of years from the start of the War of the Roses. We're going to go about 1464 thereabouts to Italy. Italy at the time was a cluster of small little fiefs and regions. You can see on the map here, very little unity along the Italian peninsula. Of course, for years it was the base of the Roman Empire, but as history showed us, that was broken up and little smaller kingdoms had been established. You will get a lot of people to say that the Renaissance, as we know it, particularly Renaissance as it pertains to the arts, was birthed by Cosimo de' Medici. He was the head of the Florence region of Italy. His family ran the main bank of the region, and they ruled the Florence region for generations. Florence was one of the city-states, and again, the Medicis were from a banking family. Cosimo was the second in the line of rulers of Florence, and he was absolutely fanatical about learning. He was just addicted to reading and discovering. He was very intellectually curious, and the subject of his intellectual curiosity were these old civilizations that we had talked about, the Romans and the Greeks. Because he was rich, he could buy the texts from scholars who had rescued them from Constantinople, and he actually started libraries in Florence and eventually spread throughout Italy. He was very, very generous with the fruits of his knowledge, that is to say, all the books that he had acquired. His study and his fascination with old Greek and Roman cultures and governments sparked the Renaissance in a broad sense, but also the idea of humanism. And humanism is basically the study of mankind. Now, that sounds like you're leaving God out, and for many humanists, they did. They explored the nature of man without regard to God. However, there were a lot of Christian humanists who studied the nature of man as it pertains to God. So, humanist can mean someone ignoring God, but it can also mean someone incorporating God. It can get a little complicated. One of the biggest things about Cosimo was that he had very interesting friends. Again, he's intellectually curious. He wants to learn. He wants to know. And he cultivated friendships with a few of the people that really became synonymous with the Renaissance. Brunelleschi, the architect, Filippo Brunelleschi, he revived architecture in modern-day Italy by rejecting the Gothic style of architecture. If you've ever seen the Cathedral of Notre Dame and all the ornamentation and and all of the decorations, if you want to call it that, very gaudy, very awe-inspiring. Brunelleschi sort of rejected that. Again, who does he go back to? He goes back to the Greeks and the Romans and their style of architecture. And he began designing various buildings with financial help from Cosimo de' Medici, and he actually traveled back to Rome to observe the old ruins there to become inspired. His most famous work is the Dome of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. It's a cathedral dome. It's known as the Dome of Florence today, and it is a good blending of the classic Greek and Roman architectures and a little bit of the Gothic. Again, it was very influential. It took 14 years to build this bad boy. Another of Cosimo's big friends, you probably recognize the name if you ever followed the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Donatello, the sculptor, the preeminent sculptor of the 15th century, inspired back Michelangelo, who we'll talk about later. He was also a student of anatomy. He studied the body. And you'll notice as we get into the Renaissance period, the art begins taking on this very lifelike form. It again, the equipment's a little bit better and whatnot, but he really studied the human body. I mean, he was very detailed about getting all of the nuances, wrinkles on the skin and everything, and it really, really brought his stuff to life. This is the statue of Gattamelata, man on horseback, and of course his work spread all over Florence, just like Brunelleschi, and influenced, again, another generation. He could influence them because we had means of communication now. People didn't just see this and take that knowledge with them. They told other people about it. And because of the printing press, even crude drawings of this great sculpture began circulating throughout Europe, and people suddenly wanted to come to Florence and see what this was all about. A couple of other artists of the time, again, humanism focuses on humanity, but also there's a section of humanists that really focus on man's relationship with God. Fra Angelico was a Dominican monk who was, by all accounts, a very gentle, peaceful, humble guy who could have become an archbishop, but he chose to remain a monk with a wonderful talent for art. Monasteries and cathedrals of the time heavily relied on art to tell the story. Why? People couldn't read for the most part. And the stories that you have heard the preacher talking about on Sundays, you could see them come to life in the incredible artwork in some of these cathedrals. And that's what Fra Angelico devoted his life to. He painted famous scenes of Mary, Christ, the crucifixion, the transfiguration. He never accepted money for his work. He was the real deal. Another artist, a contemporary, also produced great Christian art, but was the polar opposite of Fra Angelico. Fra Filippo Lippi was also a great artist, made many enduring pieces of Christian art. Unfortunately, he was involved with some of the models that you used. He was kicked out of the monastery for his dalliances, but his art lived on. Again, they told him you can keep painting, but you can't do it in here as a monk as long as you're going to do that. But bottom line, Cosimo de' Medici, when he died in 1464, reportedly the rich, the poor, everybody in Florence grieved over his death. He was very well liked, and he was named after death Pater Patriae, which is father of his country. And Cosimo de' Medici is a name that is revered in Italian history even today. Final part of this week's lesson, we're going to go a little bit to the west and go to Spain. Two names you've probably heard of, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. You almost certainly know them as the royal couple who financed the first of Christopher Columbus's voyages to the New World. Spain, much like Italy, was divided at the time into lots of sub-kingdoms. Again, there was no nation of Spain at this point, but there were commonalities among these cultures which would eventually produce the nation of Spain. Ferdinand was the prince of the kingdom of Aragon. Isabella was the princess of the kingdom of Castile. She was a very devout Catholic. Their marriage in 1469 brought together the two largest kingdoms of Spain. Their wedding was a grand event that lasted a whole doggone week. It was a big deal. And oddly enough, the historians tell us that it was an arranged marriage. We know how that works, again. But they genuinely seem to like each other, even love each other, which is, you don't always get that in these political arranged marriages. Spain was coming off of its golden age. And again, for those of you who were in the class last year, you remember us talking about the southern part of Spain, Granada, the Castilian kingdom, heavily Muslim, but it had lots of influence from Christian and Jews as well. Ferdinand and Isabella continued what was called the Reconquista of Spain, the reconquering, where the Christians basically militarily drove the Muslims to the very, very south in the Castile region, of the Spanish Peninsula. Under Ferdinand and Isabella, though, they began to take on a new target of their religious scorn: Jews. Jews were very prosperous in Spain for several centuries. Again, in the southern area of Granada, they lived more or less well with Muslims, even though it was Muslim controlled, and Muslims clearly called the shots. Heavy Jewish influence down there too. For whatever reason, and there's any number you could speculate on, Ferdinand and Isabella really targeted the Jews, and their targeting of the Jews became known as the Spanish Inquisition. It wasn't really a thing or an event, but rather a process, the process of putting someone on trial in a court. Evidently, as the Christians gained more authority in Spain, Jewish people were converting just so they wouldn't upset the apple cart. But they weren't really converting. They were still practicing Judaism in private. Well, the Ferdinand and Isabella decided that that was not going to be good enough. Again, years ago, when Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian, he began the process of marrying the church and the crown. And history has told us, history has demonstrated, that produces human misery, because you don't know who your master is. And it continued here under Ferdinand and Isabella. They began requiring that Jews accept public baptism, which would be more than just a profession of faith, obviously. They probably, again, if you're a Christian, you've heard the story of Saul the Pharisee, who thought he was doing the right thing by persecuting these early Christians. And he thought he was on the side of the angels. And he later, of course, realized, as Paul, the Christian, that he was not. Ferdinand and Isabella and those who carried out these terrible inquisitions probably thought they were doing God's work. And if you think you're on the side of the Lord, you can justify a lot of things. And the Inquisition was terrible. Jews were killed. Jews were killed by the hundreds. 32,000 is probably the most accurate idea. And again, I'm not going to get into the methods they used to kill them, but it was more than just an execution. I'll just leave it at that. The first part of the Spanish Inquisition, like we said, was directed at the Jews who claimed to convert to Christianity. What happened was the secret Jews were arrested, put on trial, and if they did not answer the Inquisitioners' questions satisfactorily, they were put to death. A Dominican friar named Torquemada, Tomas de Torquemada, was Isabella's childhood priest, a very strict priest, but again, she was very devout. And he was a friar who thought nothing was wrong with actually torturing people to make them confess their sins against the church. I think we could all agree that the Jesus we worship would not endorse the torture of someone to try to get them to convert to Christianity. By 1492, the same year they bankrolled Columbus's journey, Ferdinand and Isabella issued what was called the Edict of Expulsion. Basically, they forced Jews to leave Spain within 3 months if they did not get baptized. About 800,000 Jews fled Spain. That was roughly 1/4 of their population, according to the best guesses we have. And it was a great loss to Spain because a lot of the Jewish people were fairly successful in business. They took their businesses, their skills, their books, their families, all throughout Europe. And oddly enough, it was the largest mass exodus of Jews in Europe until World War II. The oddest thing about all this is that other than the Inquisition, Ferdinand and Isabella are genuinely regarded as a good, effective king and queen. It's like, other than that, how's the play, Mr. Lincoln? Anyway, Ferdinand and Isabella, when you look at it from a sober history standpoint, were actually effective rulers, except for the whole Inquisition thing. We're going to have a lot of parts of history. I've said it before. We'll say it again. History is good. It is bad. It is indifferent. It is messy. It is essential. And there are very few historical figures that were 100% evil or 100% good. Matter of fact, there's zero. But Ferdinand and Isabella, while being very devout, took their devotion a lot too far. And that's one of the problems, one of the many examples of the problems with marrying the church and the state. It just doesn't work. Anyway, we'll talk more about this on Monday, and have a great rest of the weekend.